right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I've enjoyed my time here learning more about what Korea is doing in this space. So I'm going to take a little bit of liberty today to at least explain what I see is going on in the Korean economy and innovation space, which obviously most of you are deeper experts than I am. But sometimes it's useful to get the impressions and observations of an outsider, particularly one as we do that looks around the world at what's happening in this space. So ITIF is a think tank in Washington. We are ranked by the University of Pennsylvania as the top science and technology policy think tank in the world. And we focus in a wide variety of areas and industries and produce lots and lots of reports. So that's a book we wrote for Yale Press a few years ago called Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage. So today I want to talk really about three big things that I see as challenges and opportunities for Korea. The first being essentially slowing the rate of productivity growth. The second is moving from being a fast follower to being an innovation leader. And the third is more about industrial structure and firm size. So I certainly understand the importance of inclusive innovation, but at its base, inclusive innovation depends upon robust economic growth. If GDP and the economic pie are not growing, it's hard to be more inclusive. And when you look at, there we go, sorry. When you look at Korean productivity growth, what you can see here is, pressing the wrong button, my apologies. There we go. That growth has started to slow down a little bit. And in particular, Korean productivity growth compared to US productivity growth, that gap was closing rapidly for many, many, many years. And then really after the Great Recession, Korea started to close that gap much more slowly. So as you can see there, right now, Korea's productivity is just a little bit above half of US labor productivity. So that really, to me, is the most important statistic one can offer, which is if you want to achieve high income status, as the United States has, if you want to catch up to the United States, which is certainly possible, you have to find a way to raise that rate of productivity growth. That the current rate here just isn't going to get you as where you need to go, particularly as Korea faces tough competition from China, which is raising its productivity growth faster now than Korea. So how do we raise productivity? The title of this entire session is called The Paradigm Shift for the Korean Economy. Let me suggest what I think that paradigm shift fundamentally should be. In the post-war period, Korea focused really on one main strategy, and that was export-led growth through increasing value-added industries, so shipbuilding, steel, consumer electronics, and the like. I would argue that while that strategy paid off enormously, that it really has reached the limits of its potential to drive Korean economic growth. Now, to drive economic growth, you have to be able to find a way to raise productivity in all sectors of the economy. If you look at why Japan has stalled out, Japan has stalled out because while their productivity in industries like consumer electronics, steel, and autos is incredibly high, in fact, it's higher than the United States, their productivity in many, many other sectors that are not traded globally, retail trade, banking, commerce, logistics, agriculture, dramatically lower than US productivity growth. So number one, getting productivity growth in all sectors is key, including in the services sector. So if you look in the OECD, you compare manufacturing productivity to services productivity in the OECD, and services on average are 86% as productive as manufacturing. In Korea, Korean services are only 45% as productive as manufacturing. So that means, really, at the end of the day, the only way to raise productivity in Korea in a sustainable way is to get services to become more productive. How do you do that? Well, it's pretty clear from the evidence from OECD and others around the world that ICT, in enterprise use of ICT, is a key enabler and driver of growth. Again, you look at that compared to the US. The US, 30% of business investments were in ICT compared to just 10% in Korea. IT capital, or ICT capital, contributed 8% to Korean productivity growth, 30% to US productivity growth. According to the OECD, on average, the typical Korean firm invests half of what the typical US firm invests in ICT. So half in terms of software, hardware, cloud computing, and the like. So I see that as sort of the #1 challenge for Korea. Productivity across the board and much deeper and stronger ICT use. Korea is an amazing leader in ICT development. So companies like Samsung leading in semiconductors, for example, are among the leaders. But it's also ICT use. The second is really about switching from being a fast follower to a leader. One could make an argument that fast followership was an incredibly productive strategy for Korea. You weren't generally the leader, you weren't generally doing first to the world innovations, but you were close behind, you took those innovations, you were able to scale them up, make improvements, and then sell globally. And many of your companies have been incredible successes. The problem, though, now is that Korea risks really being stuck in the middle. China is really becoming the new fast follower. India is getting there. And yet Korea hasn't been able to move fully from being a fast follower on innovation to being a global leader in innovation. And you have tough competitors. The US clearly, but many Northern European nations, and to some extent Japan, really you could argue are global leaders in innovation. So that means, among other things, building a system for high growth startups where Korea really lags. I put this map of California and there's little 5 things here because we recently wrote a report looking at high growth startups in the United States. Robert Reich at lunch today said that even high growth startups, even high tech startups in the US have fallen. That's actually incorrect. There are more high growth, high technology startups in 2016 than there were in 2006. We did a study, ITIF did a study where we looked at 5 million high technology startups in the United States. One of the things we found is in the time that I'm giving my talk today, in that period of time, there will be 5 high technology startups launched in California. So there have already been 2 launched, just as I've spoken, there'll be 3 more. In other words, California is a machine that just generates high-tech, high-growth startups. The US does a pretty good job overall of that as well. That's really what Korea has to do. This is an index from the Global Startup Monitor Ecosystem Ranking. Ranks the top 20 metropolitan areas as the most beneficial places to start high-growth, high-tech companies. As you can see, Seoul is not on that list. Many, many US cities are on that list, as well as certainly some others. So I would argue that one of the goals for Korea should be within 5 years, at least 5 years, have Seoul be on that list somehow. Why is it so hard in Korea? There's a study that the European Commission did, and it surveyed citizens from 50 to 100 countries and asked them questions about entrepreneurship. One of the questions is, why do you start a business? And in the US, those who started a business out of opportunity versus necessity. What does that mean? You start a business out of necessity because you've lost your job, you don't know what else to do, and so you open up a little business. as opposed to you've got a great idea, you quit your job because you think you can do something incredible. About 60% of Americans who start businesses do it because of opportunity. And only about 20% of Koreans who start a business do it because of opportunity. 80% do it out of necessity. One of the key challenges, not just in Korea, but many, many countries around the world, is if you fail, you've sort of lost your big chance. In the United States, it's not uncommon for entrepreneurs who fail to be able to just easily go back, raise money for a second time, start another company, and have that succeed. Or even sometimes have that fail. So in Korea, for example, only about 25% of citizens in Korea believe that someone who fails once should get a second chance. In the United States, half of the population feels that way. I was talking to a group of Japanese officials recently, and they asked me a question. I mentioned that my son is learning computer science, wants to start a company, and I was asked, what do I think about that? And I said I was thrilled, because if he succeeds in starting his company, he might make large amounts of money and give some of it to me, which I think he should. But if he fails, he would gain incredible skills and knowledge and experience that he would then take on to a big company or another small company. And I asked my Japanese host, I said, well, how would you feel if your son started a company? He said, no, because if he failed, his life would be over. And that is a pretty stark reality about how and why the Japanese are simply not as entrepreneurial. They're innovative, but they're not as entrepreneurial as the US. Another question here is, in general, I'm willing to take risks. 45% of Americans said, yeah, I'm willing to take risks. But only about 10% of Koreans said they personally were willing to take risks. So I put all this up there because it suggests to me that culture is so important, and culture, I believe, can change. You look at a country like Sweden, where 10 years ago many of the attitudes were similar to Korea, and they made a concerted effort through the corporate sector, through the government, to really make it clear that they wanted people to take risks and be entrepreneurs. So what do you need to do? One, as I mentioned, build a culture of risk-taking that celebrates entrepreneurs. They have a festival in Helsinki every year. I think it's called Slush, because it's in the middle of winter and it's freezing cold and dark. But it's this sort of celebration, this making it clear that you want everybody to do this. Teach creativity and entrepreneurship. In the United States, we probably have 300, 400, 500 entrepreneurship programs in universities. Develop a support system for gazelle entrepreneurs. And when I say gazelle entrepreneurs, I mean entrepreneurs, not somebody who's going to go open up a little store on the corner and hire 2 people. I don't think we should care about that. If they want to do it, feel free. It doesn't help the economy. What I mean is individuals who want to start a company that ultimately will become a successful, growing, large company that generates dynamism. So we need support systems. One of the best in the country, in the world, I would argue, is a program in San Diego, California called UC Connect. UC Connect has played a central role in turning San Diego from largely a naval-based town, where that's where the US Navy was, and a tourism destination 40 years ago, to one of the high-tech hubs now in the world. I think another challenge for Korea is how to diversify your R&D system. You have some great global companies, but what I did is a little calculation here. If you know the Herfindahl Index, which is you take the market share of the top 4 companies, you multiply it together, basically you get a number. I took the largest 4 companies in the US in terms of their share of total corporate R&D. These are companies like Apple and Intel. You just take those 4 companies and you get an HHI of 60. You take the largest 4 companies in Korea in terms of R&D, you get an HHI of 2,600. So what that tells you is if you look at the US innovation system, yes, we have some great companies that are world leaders, but we have lots and lots and lots of R&D performing companies of all different sizes. So we have a much more diverse innovation system. Another key step is to reform university-related policies to commercialization. I will argue that the US has the best system in the world. We have places like, obviously, MIT and Stanford and Caltech that you've all heard about. But we have other places you may not have heard about, like University of Utah, which does an incredible job of taking R&D that University of Utah professors do and turning it into new companies or moving that technology out into Utah into existing companies. How do they do that? What do the countries around the world do? Well, one key step you could do in Korea, which is what Sweden and Finland have done, is to simply say to universities, we're going to allocate a portion of your budget based on how well you do setting up new companies, commercializing technologies. Right now, most universities, and I shouldn't speak for Korea, but I can just mention around the world, most universities fundamentally don't care about commercialization. They care about teaching, if they're lucky, and doing research. And what we've seen in the US is when you combine that with a real focus on commercialization, which is what Stanford did from the 1950s, what MIT has been doing since the 1920s, you get powerful innovation engines. Another example of what we've done in the US, give students the right to intellectual property for patents or other kinds of IP that they invent, and then give students help so that they can build companies. A simple measure that you could do in Korea would just be to simply rank every university in Korea on how well it's doing on factors like starting new companies, student and faculty entrepreneurship, technology commercialization, and the like. Just simply ranking universities will lead to a healthy competition so that the best ones get better and the laggards start to catch up. Spurring collaboration. It's striking how few Korean firms, when you look at the OECD data, collaborate with universities or governments. Just 6.8% of Korean firms collaborate on R&D. You compare that to 16% in Germany and 24% in the UK. International collaboration is even more problematic. Just 0.5% of Korean firms collaborate internationally on R&D, compared to 26% in Finland and 36% in the UK. So how do you do that? Well, one of the steps that we, ITIF, helped launch in the United States was a collaborative R&D tax credit. Another is to establish more joint university research centers that bring the two parties together. Lastly, on this point, I think it's one of the most important things for policymakers to understand about this is that small business is not the same as high growth business. Entrepreneurship is not the same as business startups. When Schumpeter, the famous economist, talked about entrepreneurship, what he meant was something that is new to an economy, not somebody opening up another restaurant. That's not new, that's not entrepreneurship, that's just small business. So, what does that mean? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It means really focusing on that small subset. This is from our study in the US. Just 0.3% of businesses in the US are in technology, they're startups, and they're high growth. So a very, very small number of firms in the United States are really the key engines of the future. Not just startups, but this part right here. Okay. So, lastly, and this is probably where I'll probably get the most controversy or maybe disagreement. My colleague Mike Lind and I wrote a book about 2 months ago from MIT Press called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And what we tried to do in that book was look around the world at what do the facts show about the relative performance of large companies versus small companies. And what we found in every single country in the world, large companies have higher productivity, they pay better wages, they have better and longer sustaining jobs, they export more, they're generally more innovative on average. When you look at Korea, though, Korea, again, you look at the OECD numbers, Korea is an outlier. Korea has the largest share of small firms of any OECD nation. The share of output from large firms actually has fallen. The share of employment in SMEs has grown. And you compare, for example, this last 91% of jobs are in SMEs compared to just 44% in the US. You look at Korean manufacturing firms compared to the US. What you see is almost about 80% of manufacturing firms have just 1 to 9 employees in Korea. Less than 0.5% have more than 250. The US, you can see a much, much bigger share of firms in manufacturing in the US are larger. Why does that matter? Because scale is critical now to competing in the global economy. Scale is critical to boosting productivity, and scale is critical to innovation. As I said before, having a large share of small firms means you're going to have slower growth, and it means you're going to have less innovation. 49% of Korean SMEs are innovative compared to 73% of large firms, and yet over 50% of Korean SMEs receive support for innovation. That's the highest share of any OECD country. So half of the firms are getting some kind of support, but they're not really all that innovative. So what does it mean? I think what it means is it is very difficult politically. I grasp that point. But it really means beginning to shift the large array of policies that every country has, but Korea has it more, of just simple subsidies, regulatory favors, tax benefits that are just given to small firms just because they're small. And it means moving away from that to size neutrality, and then a specific focus on the high growth, high technology firms that should and hopefully will power Korea's future. With that, I thank you very much.